Thank you for listening to the John Calvin podcast. For early access, bonus episodes, and a range of community benefits, sign up at johncalvinpod.com/support. That's johncalvinpod.com/support. Welcome back to the John Calvin podcast. My name is Matt. We've been looking at the most famous showdown in John Calvin's life, and that is the showdown with the notorious heretic Michael Servetus. In the last episode, we were looking at Servetus as a person and introducing the conflict between him and Calvin. And today we're going to be looking at the trial of Servetus. Servetus has dramatically escaped from prison in Vienna. They've burned an effigy of him in his absence. His plan, he says, is to go to Naples in Italy to practice medicine. But for some insane and inexplicable reason, Servetus decides to go to Calvin's Geneva, which will end up being one of the worst decisions of his life because Servetus will end up being sentenced to death and being burned at the stake in October 1553. The horror of this event continues to cast a shadow, in popular imagination at least, over the character of John Calvin. And so we're going to try to understand this very sad episode in many ways, and to understand Calvin's involvement in the death of Servetus. The minister of Bern, the brilliantly named Wolfgang Musculus, comments that Servetus had recently come to Geneva to take advantage of the rancour with which the government pursued Calvin. He hoped to obtain a foothold from which he would be able to carry on the affair with the other churches. So Musculus is saying that Servetus came to Geneva not primarily as a poor refugee of persecution, but with nefarious motives, really, to stir up trouble for Calvin. Given Servetus's complete obsession with Calvin, this seems at least believable. Servetus attends a Sunday afternoon church service in Geneva on the 13th of August 1553, and the story picks up with Servetus being recognised and promptly arrested by the secular authorities. The laws of Geneva require that in serious cases, the complainant himself should be incarcerated pending the result of the trial. In this case, people feel that Calvin's health is too fragile, and so Calvin's poor secretary, Nicholas de la Fontaine, agrees to take the short straw and to go to prison for the duration of the trial. So feel kind of sorry for him, though I'm sure, given how notorious Servetus was, that he was willing to do it. In total, there are 38 articles submitted against Servetus. They include his denials of the Trinity, his idea that people can't commit mortal sins until they're 20 years old, his idea that infant baptism is invented by the devil. They also accuse Servetus of defaming Calvin and, quote, uttering all the injurious and blasphemous things which it is possible to invent. It's important to emphasize at this point that Servetus doesn't appear before Calvin or the consistory. The trial is handled by the secular authorities who ask Calvin for theological input to the trial. Now, of course, Calvin happily obliges and helps his secretary to set up the 38 articles against Servetus. Servetus is permitted to prepare a defense to the charges of heresy, and Calvin actually gives Servetus books from his own personal library for research and preparation for the trial. It's fair to say that Servetus's attitude in the trial does him no favours. Remember that these people he's standing in front of have his life quite literally in their hands. And you do begin to see the kind of unhinged aspect to some of Servetus's character in this. He likens Calvin to the father of all heresies, Simon Magus. He says about Calvin, as a sorcerer, he should be not only condemned but exterminated and driven from this city, and his goods should be adjudged to me in recompense for mine. He calls Calvin a worthless and shameless twister and a blind wretch. Calvin is brought into the trial to respond to Servetus's quoting of the church fathers in support of his arguments. But given Calvin's near photographic memory, he's able to skewer Servetus on that point and to demonstrate that the church fathers really did believe in the Trinity. So this idea that there's three distinct persons in the one divine essence. Calvin gives his take on what should happen to Servetus in a letter to Farel. He says, quote, "I hope that the sentence of death will at least be passed upon him, but I desire that the severity of the punishment may be mitigated." So like the majority of early modern people, Calvin is in agreement that Servetus deserves death, but he wants Servetus to be shown mercy. A key moment in the trial, though, is when Vienne hears that Servetus has been caught, and they demand that he be extradited so that they can try him in Vienne. They send the jailer and the captain who are guarding him, and who also bring along the sentence that was given against Servetus and when they burned the effigy of him. And in an interesting move, the magistrates ask Servetus what he wants. Does he want to be tried in Vienne or to stay in Geneva? And reportedly, Servetus falls to his knees and begs with tears that he's allowed to stay in Geneva to be tried there, which you could argue is a positive reflection on the legal processes in Geneva as opposed to Vienne. In the end, the magistracy decide that they will not extradite Servetus. In his helpful book on this, Jonathan Moorhead comments that there is no doubt that Geneva's refusal to deliver Servetus to Vienne put further pressure on them to mete out justice, since they could not be seen as being any less zealous for the truth than their detractors. And this chimes with what I've been reading recently in Alistair McGrath's biography of Calvin, where he talks about how defensive the magistrates were about their jurisdiction and power, often at Calvin's expense, actually. The key people sentencing Servetus are actually some of Calvin's most bitter enemies, and again, it's important to remember that. But at this time in history, Protestants are very sensitive to the Roman Catholic charge that they're too lenient on heresy. So the Zurich reformers write to Geneva and say, quote, "Our churches have abroad the bad reputation of being heretical and of being particularly favourable to heresy. Holy Providence at this time affords you an opportunity of freeing yourselves and us from that injurious suspicion, if you know how to be vigilant and active in preventing the further spreading of that poison." So Geneva seeks out the advice of the other Swiss cities, and they all come back with the same advice, that Servetus deserves death, and that this is an opportunity to demonstrate to the world that Protestants are just as zealous and serious about stamping out heresy as anyone else. In the end, the period from Servetus's arrest on the 13th of August to his burning on the 27th of October 1553 is just over 2 months. Although the argument could be made that Servetus was a dead man as soon as he entered Geneva, I think that's quite harsh on the Genevans. We know from other cases that they were very reluctant to dish out the death penalty to heretics. They preferred to exile them or get them to recant. But because of Servetus's fame and the horror that his books have produced across Christendom, there's a sense that his is a much more serious case. And as I mentioned earlier, Servetus's unhinged manner, his combative attitude in the trial, his insulting of Calvin and the company of pastors, safe to say, went down like a lead balloon. Servetus demonstrates no respect or humility when he's addressing the people who have the authority to kill him or let him go. And all of this, unfortunately, is going to count against him in the end. And we'll be looking at the kind of harrowing and awful events surrounding the sentencing and execution of Servetus in the next episode, and Calvin's role in all of that as he tries, unsuccessfully, to change Servetus's sentence from burning to a more humane death by beheading. Historically, you can see why the magistrates felt that they needed to make an example of Servetus. The reformed cities were regularly being insulted and accused of being hotbeds of disorder and heresy by Roman Catholics, and the trial of Servetus came to be viewed as an opportunity for them to say, the reform we want is about change, yes, but not chaos. And it's in effect an opportunity for them to say, we can also be the people of law and order, as it were. The fate of Servetus is, of course, appalling by standards today, although it's clear that Calvin is not a fan of Servetus or his theology. One can't help but wonder what might have happened if the magistrates had actually listened to Calvin and showed mercy to Servetus. If not in exiling him, then at least in giving him a more humane form of execution. But it's very unlikely given the context that they would have been willing to let Servetus go. Who knows, maybe Calvin would have gained a more sympathetic representation in popular culture if they'd listened to Calvin's advice. Thank you so much for listening, and we're going to be carrying on this series by looking at the sentencing and execution of Michael Servetus next week. Goodbye.